Welcome to part 2 of the history of Battlefield. In the first episode, we took a look at Battlefield 1942 and how DICE, the developer of Battlefield, was formed. Today, we will have a look at the follow-up game to Battlefield 1942 and its add-ons, the first spin-off, Battlefield Vietnam. About 2 years after the successful release of Battlefield 1942, Battlefield Vietnam was released. A game that took the Battlefield gamer from the bloody combat zones of the Second World War and catapulted them into the 1960s and 70s into the eponymous Vietnam. Surprisingly, the game in question was not developed by DICE. The development took place at EA Canada, which later became an official department of DICE. But back then, Digital Illusions Creative Entertainment only provided support for the project because they were already working on the next bigger project. That is probably the reason why some of the old-school Battlefield fans see Vietnam as the foster child that never got enough love. While many gaming magazines gave favorable ratings to Battlefield Vietnam and a lot of the reviews on Metacritic are positive, the game was nothing more than a stopgap solution until the next big release. Admittedly, it was a good stopgap solution, but in many areas you can clearly notice that time was a limiting factor for innovation. This, however, did not stop the developers at EA Canada to iron out a few flaws and make detail improvements. Even though they were using the same engine that powered Battlefield 1942 before, the visuals were vastly improved upon. Their build of the Refractor 2 engine was pushed to the limit, making especially the vegetation a lot prettier and denser than in the predecessor. For the early 2000s, they've created a real immersive jungle feeling. And even though it may look a little empty and lifeless for modern standards, you have to keep in mind that when this game was released, photorealistic foliage like in Crysis or Far Cry was far away. At least on such a vast scale. The game was released in 2004, the same year as Half-Life 2, which has admittedly much better graphics. But since Half-Life takes place in rather confined spaces, it is a lot easier to flex the graphical muscles when you don't have to create several kilometer-large multiplayer maps. Apart from pure visual improvements of the landscape, the animation department saw improvements as well. Most notably, several new, more or less realistic reload animations. For example, for the bolt-action rifles, you now have proper animations, not simply just lowering the gun. Gameplay-wise, Battlefield Vietnam took multiple steps forward, and on rare occasions, a few steps back. The medic class was cut from the game, because according to the developers, it was the least popular class in the previous game. Sadly, we never got to see any proof of that, but seeing how almost every second building had medical supplies in it, I can believe that. At least in my memory, the medic class was really a rare sight. So one could say removing the medic was a step to make Battlefield Vietnam more hardcore. But if you are less charitable, one could say, yeah, they were just too lazy to make the class work. Your choice. Now let us focus on the new additions to the game and small improvements. Finally, you got a progression bar when capturing control points, a feature that strangely enough was missing from Battlefield 1942 and was never added in a patch or expansion pack. Furthermore, you are now able to make rudimentary character customizations and choose between two different loadouts per class with differing primary weapons and gadgets. This allowed for different playstyles within the same class. Probably the most important new feature were the helicopters. This new weapon system not only played a major role in the real Vietnam War, but also mixed up the Battlefield gameplay quite drastically. And before we get any complaints, but helicopters were not first implemented in Battlefield Vietnam, they were available in mods before. Yes, that is true, and we'll address that in a specialized video on mods, because Battlefield mods are just so significant, they deserve their own video. The helicopters not only allowed for fast movement over long distances, or for infantry and equipment to be dropped right into the heart of the battle, but also provided mobile fire support like the Cobra attack helicopter. And unlike fighter planes, the helicopters allowed for precision strikes because their ability to hover enabled them to hold and secure areas for longer and not only to strafe the enemy before they have to make a turn for another attack run. Next to the heavily armed combat helicopters, the game also offered a variety of transport helicopters, including the famous UH-1, better known as the Huey. A machine that even people who know nothing about helicopters or military equipment, they know it. Maybe not by name, but they've definitely seen one. In Battlefield Vietnam, the Huey was even included in a gunship version, sacrificing transport capacity for rocket launchers and a Gatling gun. Little trivia, the nickname Huey stems from heavy fighting around the city of Hue, where this particular helicopter played a vital role. And the last helicopter in the American arsenal was the ACH Chinook helicopter, a big beast of a transport helicopter that was able to airlift whole tanks. And of course, even this transporter was not unarmed. Machine guns and rockets are a must-have, because America. Little side note, you could listen to music while you were in vehicles, and you were able to add your own music to the game files, so... America, America. While the American army was dominating the skies with modern equipment, the North Vietnamese side was getting by with older Soviet equipment, namely the Mi-8 helicopter. That, like the Huey, existed in a transport and a combat variant, but these were of course rather underpowered compared to their American counterparts. Besides the helicopters, classic fighter planes were of course also included in the game, like the American F-4 Phantom with heat-seeking missiles, a type of weapon that I consider to be slightly overpowered in the game, because the enemy can take no countermeasures to defend themselves against this. Flares were not really a thing for little M8 helicopters. And besides the heat-seeking missiles, the maybe more deadly weapon were the napalm bombs, able to turn every player into a living torch within seconds, preferably of course enemy players. The A-7 Corsair was the second plane for the United States and South Vietnamese side, and even though it was not armed with heat-seeking missiles, this fighter's autocannons proved to be very effective against ground targets. The North Vietnamese armies were of course only able to field less sophisticated equipment once again. Nonetheless, their MiG-17s and 21s were quite deadly devices in the right player's hands, maybe even more than the Americans' F-4 Phantom. The MiG-21's autocannon and bombs made it into a formidable multi-role fighter. But air support was not available on every map, therefore players had to rely on ground vehicles more than often. Amongst them the good old Willys Jeep with a gigantic TOW missile, the M113 armored personnel carrier, the M551 Sheridan and the M48 Patton. On a few selected maps, the US Army even had mobile artillery support. This was provided by the M110A2 howitzer, a really big piece of ordnance. And as usual, on the North Vietnamese side we mostly got inferior equipment and vehicles. Besides the stationary M46 130mm cannon, the UAZ-469 and the Vespa scooter, we got the BM-21 launcher, a direct descendant of the famous Katyusha. Also we got the BTR-60, the PT-76 light tank, the ZSU-57-2 as well as the T-54, but also the T-72, a very modern tank at the time, capable of taking on the American M48 easily. And to be honest, the inclusion of that tank on the map Fall of Saigon seems rather odd to me, since I could not find any historical information on the T-72 in North Vietnamese service at that time. Unlike its predecessor, Battlefield Vietnam did not feature any large-scale battleships, a fact owed to the setting of the game. The developers did however include the PBR patrol boat and the Tango ATC, famously featured in movies like Platoon. When looking at the list of vehicles, which is for the record not complete, the AC-130 and such are missing, cause well, the list is pretty long. We quickly realize that the North Vietnamese side has the by far inferior equipment. The asymmetrical gameplay, which was noticeable in Battlefield 1942 mostly through the map design, was here expanded onto almost every aspect of the game. While the Americans were fielding modern infantry weapons like the M16, which was even available in a sniper configuration, the M40 bolt-action rifle, or the Kar-15, available with an underbarrel grenade launcher, or the M60 machine gun, the North Vietnamese side was partially armed with weapons dating back to the Second World War, like the Mosin Nagant rifle. Other North Vietnamese small arms were the DPM LMG, the SKS, or the famous AK, in this case a Chinese copy, the Type 56. Furthermore, the North Vietnamese side made use of the SVD Dragunov and the Type 67 stick grenade, a Chinese-made grenade based on the German Model 24 hand grenade. And again, it becomes clear who has the better equipment. I think we drove that point home enough. So, how is this game balanced? What the North Vietnamese soldier lacked in modern equipment, they made up for in ingenuity in designing booby traps.
Be careful, it could be a booby trap.
Otto.
Besides tripwires and punji traps, a nasty device which usage is condemned by the Geneva Convention, the communist forces were able to set up mobile spawn points and often relied on a vast tunnel network to obscure the movement of their troops. These are just a few things that made the life of the GIs or South Vietnamese soldier pretty hard. And leaving the cruelty of reality behind for a second, in the gaming world, it was great fun to try to trap the opponents. Besides the punji trap and stuff, other nasty devices were of course explosives, anti-tank mines and RPGs, and not to forget the portable mortar, a powerful device that many of you might know from Battlefield 3. This imbalance of power and asymmetrical gameplay proved to be a massive amount of fun to play. While often considering myself superior to the NVA when blowing them up with helicopters as an American or South Vietnamese soldier, I also had a lot of fun when I, as Charlie, suddenly jumped out of the bushes and ambushed the enemy or overran them from the flanks. And even though modern features like sprinting or auto-healing were missing, it made for a thrilling experience. And adding some more of the modern perspective, the game had no loot boxes and no unlocks, only one clear objective and a whole bunch of enemies who were trying to keep you from achieving said objective. A wonderful feature that was included in Battlefield Vietnam and I've been missing since Bad Company are bots in multiplayer battles. I know bots are often frowned upon and the ones in Battlefield Vietnam are no shining example of good AI, but filling a map with up to 64 computer-controlled allies and opponents intensifies the battles massively. And a combat zone full of life is more immersive than meeting an occasional player in the bush or while fighting for air supremacy. All these intense battles were distributed over 18 different maps, and to name a few of these classics, Hue, Ho Chi Minh, Saigon, Co Tien, and many more. Admittedly, some were repetitive, as for the example, there are 2 versions of Saigon, but still, both are well playable. A few minutes ago I mentioned the music, and at this point I think I want to bring it up again. In the previous video about Battlefield 1942, the soundtrack was declared to be a major part of the game's success and of the franchise as a whole. In the case of Battlefield Vietnam, we won't make such a bold statement, but the original 60s and 80s licensed music in the game improved the atmosphere tremendously. Sadly, we could not play you anything for copyright reasons. But just go and listen to Fortunate Son from Creedence Clearwater Revival or Painted Black, they really transfer the atmosphere of the time greatly. Battlefield Vietnam, an offshoot that introduced many improvements over its already trend-setting predecessor. Sadly, it is one of the lesser-known Battlefield games, yet for us here at ESCalation, a game that we hold quite dear. It was one of the best in the early 2000s, in a fresh and unused setting that just captured the atmosphere of that war like almost no other game. Maybe it is comparable to how brilliantly Grand Theft Auto Vice City captured the feeling of its era. Anyways, Battlefield Vietnam was and is still a game worth remembering and playing. And on these flattering words, I want to end this episode of the history of Battlefield. If you enjoyed this video, stick around for the next episode and maybe check out some of our other content. Until then, have a nice day and as always, goodbye and guten Tag.